Well, Paul is in his final battle movement against the false teaching and the pressures that was opposing the church at Colossae. So verse number 20, as it opens up, it's going to address the folly of going back to the ritual after knowing the reality of Christ. And then as we go through the rest of the verses, Paul is going to, through his play of words, he's going to basically say over and over again, why go back? Why go back to the ritual? Do you really want to live like that? Why would you do that? Why would you go back? Do you really want to do that? You see, this text is Paul's final plea to set aside religion in favor of a relationship with Christ. So as we get into verse number 20, towards the beginning, it has a statement of being dead with Christ. Paul is reminding the believers at Colossae that they are dead with Christ, therefore they should not go back to the former things. Well, what are some of these former things that are being mentioned? Well, one of the first ones mentioned is the rudiments of the world. Now, Dr. John Phillips says that this refers to the elementary rules. Now, this is a similar phrase to verse number 8, whereas it also talks about the rudiments of the world, but it's used in a different way. You see, verse 8, it uses it in reference to dwelling on the basics, whereas there's false teachers that say, just know the basics and you'll be okay. And just know, well, of course, we understand the folly of that because you'll never grow into a true, mature adult, Christian adult as you should. But that's not the way it's being used here. You see, verse 20 refers to being dead with Christ, so why go back to the elementary rules of the Mosaic law? And then Paul is going to address that throughout the rest. You see, remember, the ritual of the Mosaic laws has given way to the reality. Because remember, the Mosaic laws were simply a shadow of something that was to come. And that shadow was pointing to the reality of Christ. You see, Christ was the perfect man. And you see, we could never, ever on our own, we could never be good enough to be made right in God's eyes of our own accord. You see, and that's what the law was pointing out, that no matter how much we try to live up to the perfection, no matter how much we try to live up to all the goodness that the Mosaic law tries to portray, we can never be good enough. But Jesus Christ, He is good enough. And He was the fulfillment of the law. And so the ritual has given way to the reality, and that reality was Christ. And so then through the rest of the verses, it has talk of the ordinances with all their restrictions. And then as verse 21 says, touch not, in reference to the ceremonial defilement, taste not the forbidden foods, handle not, getting a feel for forbidden things, and all the rules associated with the old way of life, the old Mosaic law. And Paul says, why go back whenever you have the reality in Christ? You see, as we get into verse number 22, and it says, and after the commandments and the doctrines of men, why go back to that, which things have indeed a show of wisdom, and will worship and humility and neglecting of the body, not in any honor to the satisfying of the flesh. You see, it's simply a show. It's simply a shadow. It simply is pointing to something, but it's not the real deal. So why go back? You see, these verses, all the way from verse 6 all the way through 23, it shows Paul's concern for the Colossian believers with any lapse into man-made religion. You see, Dr. R.C. Lucas points out that Paul is an advocate of religionless Christianity. I like that phrase, religionless Christianity. You see, because Christianity, true biblical Christianity, isn't a religion. It's a relationship. And so Paul is showing that these false teachers, what they're doing is they're all showing an attempt of religion that could never add up to the reality. So at the very beginning of this battle. Paul addresses some of the pressures, and he addresses some of the different groups that were causing angst for Paul and concern for the Colossian believers. And that was the different false gods of the people that were around them, the Gnostic cult that was also showing pressure, the pressure from Jews and from other different Christian groups alike. And all this was simply man-made religion that was simply a showing a shadow. But they weren't walking in the reality. They weren't walking in the relationship with Christ. So we need to remember that we don't have to have ritual because we have the reality. And so therefore, any teaching that makes little of that should be cast out. So then whenever we get into chapters 3 and 4, Paul is going to show what religionless Christianity genuinely looks like. And my goodness, is it exciting, as he shows what it simply looks like to live a life that is completely engulfed in the example and the words of Christ. You see, there's going to be a bunch of different people that are going to look at this group of people there at Colossae, and as Paul is going to reform their way of life to completely surround Christ. And you see, that reason alone, it shows the error of the different groups around them. You see, Paul says that to go back to the Gnostic way of life, to go back to the old Mosaic law, to go back to even the false gods around them, to go back into any of those things would be compromised, because we have a new reality, and that reality is something that Paul is going to explore in much greater detail in chapters 3 and 4. And I look forward to getting into that in the next video. But for now, God bless you, and thank you for watching.